Good evening and welcome to the Asia Society. I'm Tom Nagorski. I'm the Executive Vice President. I thank you for braving the snowstorm that wasn't. We were expecting snowstorm number 18, and I was just chatting with our panelists that in the news business where I used to work, that was always both very exciting to some people and very annoying to some of us who were irritated that the stories about China or India or business in Asia got bumped because of snowstorms. Anyway, delighted you're here. Delighted the forecast seems to be proving wrong. We have a great program tonight, and my role is a little odd because I'm going to say a few words now, leave, and then come back to moderate. So I'll keep it really, really brief, and I just want to talk about a couple of upcoming events at the Asia Society. One is actually an ongoing event, and then a big event 2 weeks from now. As some of you know, our exhibition, Golden Visions of Densitil, is up and running in the galleries upstairs. It's getting great reviews. It's both extraordinary art and an extraordinary story about the Densitil Monastery in Tibet, which was destroyed during the Cultural Revolution, and which artifacts of which have been, for the first time, painstakingly brought back, put together, and are upstairs here until mid-May. And then the event I refer to in a couple of weeks' time is the launch of the Asia Society Policy Institute, which I guess gets underway 2 weeks from yesterday. On the 7th, we will have General John Allen, who commanded international forces in Afghanistan until last year, in conversation on this stage with ABC News' senior foreign affairs correspondent Martha Raddatz. And then carrying on into the morning after, that's April the 8th, Henry Kissinger, the IMF's Zhu Min, China's ambassador to the United States, Tsui Tang-kai, former Prime Minister of Pakistan, Shawkat Aziz, Deputy Secretary of State and sort of point person for Asia for this country, Bill Burns, and a lot of others. That is a morning up until lunch program here on the 8th of April to commemorate the formal launch of our Policy Institute here. I just want to then say a word of thanks about, well, for our partner tonight, Hunton Williams, not just our partner tonight, but for the Business of Asia series writ large. And Hunton Williams is not only supporting tonight's event, but they also have been, which not all supporters are, very engaged in the conception, thinking about what we're going to do, and those are the kind of partners we like. I'll talk a little bit more about the program when I get back on stage, as I say, but for now it's my pleasure to call to the stage managing partner for Hunton & Williams, Wally Martinez. Thank you.
Well, this is quite pleasant that I get top billing for simply coming up here for about 45 seconds. But good evening and welcome. And on behalf of Hunton & Williams, I'd like to thank the Asia Society for inviting us to sponsor this series with you. And it's entirely fitting that we have this conversation here. You know, the Asia Society, founded in 1956 by the Rockefeller family, one of the many gifts that the Rockefeller families have provided the world that stay with us today, to allow folks to learn more about Asia. And now it's evolved into a venue that, among other things, allows us to discuss and have a great conversation about issues of current relevance and importance. So allow me to introduce our panel, and I guess, Tom, that as I introduce them, they could come up and take their seats. First, we have Professor Edward Cunningham, Assistant Professor at Boston University's Department of Earth and Environment, and the Director of the Harvard Kennedy School Asia Energy and Sustainability Initiative. Next, we have Gwynn Guilford, a reporter and editor at Quartz, a digitally native news outlet for business people in the new global economy. And my colleague, Ed Koehler, who is the regional managing partner of Hunton & Williams Asia offices. And last but certainly not least, Bruce Thomas, president of Mead Westvaco's healthcare businesses. Again, thank you very much for joining us this evening. And Tom, the conversation's yours.
Nobody applauded for journalists. I don't know if you were being shy, but why don't you do that now? Why don't you? So it's a huge subject, doing business in Asia, business of Asia, a huge subject too. And so I think my job tonight is twofold. First of all, to keep things focused, and also because I know that there are some people in the audience tonight there are probably many people in the audience tonight who know a whole lot more about this subject in its general terms or specifics than I do. And so what I'd really like to do, we usually leave a short period for questions at the end. I'm going to make it longer, and if you don't have any, I'll come back. But have your questions ready, and that's a good time to remind folks we webcast everything here, so this is being seen around our global network and on Twitter and Facebook. But if you have questions, those of you watching from outside this room, you can email those to moderator@asiasociety.org or Twitter. Tweet your questions using the hashtag AskAsia. Speaking of the global network, I was struck by something, and this is not meant as Asia Society promotion, although it may come off that way. We have a lot of centers around the world, 11, and today in Australia, probably yesterday, New York time, the Prime Minister, Tony Abbott, gave an address at an Asia Society venue. And it was basically, I think, just a full-throated argument in favor of free trade arrangements throughout the region. But he said something that I thought was a good starting point for us. The global middle class projected to grow from 1.8 billion to 3 billion and more by 2020. The global middle class. Most of that growth will occur in Asia. And you all may know that figure. I didn't know or hadn't remembered how staggering it was. But I wonder if you can all take a quick crack at where you think, because that has to be the biggest global business opportunity of all time, or at least of the moment. I wonder, Ed, if you want to, where is that going to come? And if you're going to tell people looking to invest in the future, because part of what we're going to do here is give some free advice to people, talk a little bit about where you see that growth coming.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, it certainly, anytime you talk about Asia at all, you're talking about big numbers. And so when you talk about the growth of the middle class, and you see it, I see it from perspective, I think other people see it from perspective in China. I see it from perspective of Southeast Asia. We have 10 significant growth countries in Southeast Asia. There's 600 million people within that 10 country sphere. And the difference in the elevation of the middle class, I think will come, there's primarily, but it's going to come significantly from the growth within those countries. And it comes in different ways. The growth through Indonesia as a consumption society, through the Philippines as a consumption society, is far different as they grow their middle class than the society that is growing, the middle class society that grows in a place like Thailand, which is really growing through government spending. It is not a consumption society. It is a society that depends upon subsidies and government spending to provide the wherewithal for the former agricultural society to grow a bit more into the middle class. So I see it in that sphere of the middle class in different ways.
You want to take a stab at that?
Well, I think this is the law of large numbers. As Ed said, I think it's the implication of this sort of growth, in the smaller pieces that I think is really interesting and has guided all of our business thinking. I mean, for example, you take that number and you think about anything. So you take those numbers and you say, India is going to be the chronic disease capital of the world. It's just an implication of the kind of numbers that you're talking about: more diabetes patients, more heart disease patients. So, so I do think that that it is going to be in this region, that the numbers are astonishing, and in any area that you look, there are going to be such huge changes and such dramatic growth that I think that creates both the issues that need to be addressed and the business opportunities that are created as well.
Yeah, and I know we're here to talk about business opportunities specifically, but I imagine it's a great story, the growth of the middle class in those proportions. On the other hand, the challenge is if every new middle-class citizen in China, in Asia, and everywhere else wants what a middle-class citizen has, that's a great business opportunity. It also is perhaps a sustainability and resource nightmare, right? And,
in every sense.
You are a resource expert, are you not? I mean, and do you want to talk, Ed, a little bit about that?
I fake it very well. I'm not an expert. I think I would just, I would add, so I'd add 2 quick points to that former question. The first is that there's really kind of 2 sides to the coin, right? On the one hand, we are seeing this consumption boom. It's already begun. And for me, it's more interesting to think about not the goods, right, the increase in the goods consumption, but in fact, really now in most of these Asian nations, the service consumption. So I think for me, the most interesting, exciting part of the business opportunity is understanding that customer in a pretty sophisticated way to understand what their needs are, particularly in education services, which I have a bias in, of course, medical services, as was stated, but also financial services. So those are the 3 that I tend to sort of look at and spend a lot of time tracking. But in order for those that service consumption to really boom, of course, there's a flip side. And the flip side is that many of these countries have fairly high savings rates, right? So China is often labeled as sort of having this Confucian savings values. That issue is driven largely not by business, but by the flip side, which is by government. And even though governments like China have done quite a bit, China a lot more than India, in providing social welfare services and other types of public goods and services, I think it's been very difficult to match the economic growth. And so as a result, the relative lack of those services means that those savings rates are going to continue. It's very sticky. It's hard to unleash those savings. So I think that's the flip side. So we have to, I think, be quite fairly realistic about tracking the government issue. And that metric, I think, is without that, it'll be hard to unleash.
And Gwynn, you lived in China for many years until recently. Anything you want to add on what you saw in terms of this burgeoning middle class in that country?
Sure. I think that Ed nailed it, talking about savings rates and the government's role in informing those. But something else I'd add is, having spent time in Southeast Asia, the importance of, you want to find the consumers where the biggest middle class is, but you want to find the middle class who can spend. And several of these countries are facing very large overhangs of their population, their demographic shape. And by that I mean these middle-class ostensible consumers will have to take care of an enormous and growing number of elderly people. And I think most people know what Japan's like. That's starting to happen in China. It's happening in Thailand. And then on the flip side, you also have Malaysia, which is a comparatively much younger society. I think Indonesia, the Philippines, also very promising on that front. So that's a big constraint that it's really important to pay attention to, because that's really the dynamic, the driver of growth when you're talking about consumption.
All right. I want to switch subjects and countries for a moment, and I promised to mix this part forecasts in terms of what we see coming down the pike in Asia this year and going forward, and then practical advice in terms of those who are looking to do business or invest in Asia. But in terms of forecasts, we have a season, and we've been knee-deep in all these things here, of elections in many interesting places in Asia. Afghanistan coming up, Indonesia in the summer. But I want to ask about India, because there aren't that many elections or campaigns that I can recall, certainly not in India, where business and the economy have been so front and center, to the point, and let's just say for now, and I'll go out on a limb and say that Narendra Modi and the BJP are going to win. It's not much of a limb, but I'll take the calls. But so much is being said about the notion that for once in a long time, and maybe in all of our memories, India will have, if that comes to pass, a government that is actually truly friendly to business. And I want to pick on you, Bruce, because you've had a lot of experience with India. Do you think his governance in Gujarat is a real indicator? Are these expectations overblown or appropriate? Where do you land on that?
I am an enormous fan of Chief Minister Modi, and the work that he has done in Gujarat to create a business-friendly climate has been consistent and has been remarkable. I think from a business perspective, the idea of having all of India that business-friendly and that relatively easy to deal with is enticing. I also think that we think it unbelievably unrealistic. India is an incredibly complicated place, as I was mentioning earlier. A lot of the void, the vacuum, has been filled by the states, and I don't think that changes overnight. But I do think it is a very important election, and I do think that there are two big themes that are going to drive this election. The one is this pro-business attitude that I think is going to change in a positive way regardless of outcome. But the second is the topic of corruption, and there is a third party that is meaningfully engaged, the Common Man Party, which has one issue, and that is corruption in India, and has had some astonishing success in some of the early elections. So I think this idea of a business-friendly India and a less corrupt, India is going to be front and center throughout the elections, and I think both of those, developments and both of those themes are very positive.
But those of you who have clients, right, and I think that's all three of the gentlemen here, right? And do you said enticing and unbelievably unrealistic. That doesn't sound. I mean, maybe I'll ask the two Eds on the end here. Either of you want to weigh in on that? Are you bullish? Are you?
So I'm highly biased on this, and I have to always watch myself with these things because I make sure that my expertise is very much related largely to China and very much to the energy and environmental sectors. So my limited experience thus far in India has been with those types of clients. So it's been with the Reliances of the world, right, the Tata Group, they're attempting to build infrastructure for this booming nation. And it's been, it fascinates me because it gives me wonderful perspective on how easy China is to deal with. Let's put it that way. So from my perspective, to distill it, it seems it's absolutely what Bruce is saying. I also find that the lack, but again, I'm very biased on this, but the lack of structure, the lack of hierarchy. But I'm quite Confucian, I think. I've been brainwashed after 20 years. The lack of hierarchy makes it very difficult.
It's okay.
Yeah, it's quite difficult. And as a result, it's very hard to know who's actually making the decision.
Right.
Whereas in China, at least from my experience, it's, if you've done your homework, it's very clear who's making a decision. Whether they can affect it is different. India, I feel like there's 7 voices. There's 8 people, 10 voices, unclear who can make the decision. Everyone, yeah. And that to me has made a huge dent in at least what I do, which is infrastructure and energy provision. I find it very, very difficult. But
in fairness, again, that's all looking backwards a little bit, right? And there is this idea, and maybe it's, as I said, maybe it's totally overblown, that in recent memory, I don't know who said this, and I may be butchering the quote, that in India, the left is very good at winning elections, and the other side would be good at governance, and for once, maybe, from a business perspective anyway, the two may meet. Yeah.
So just to build, on that point a little bit, this is, you're exactly right, that India is it's high math. I mean, it's a complicated, chaotic place, and things get done, and you always kind of wonder how. Gujarat was, to the extent there was a completely different experience, Gujarat has been that, and it was very clear that at the end of the day, who was going to make the decision, and Chief Minister Modi would make those decisions, and things would happen. The question is that a scalable governance model? So the sort of CEO model works on a state level, very uncertain as to whether it works on a national level. And I think that's the unrealistic point of it. But I will tell you that that I think if you just take Tata for example, the different experience they had, they were in one state, had a very difficult time getting the plan established. They went to another state, and it happened just like that. So that's the Gujarati experience that has people optimistic, but I think it's a governance model that highly unscalable.
Yeah, I agree. Because it is so decentralized. I mean, that's the reality.
All right.
Tom, just on that for a second, and to sort of move it off India just a little bit, but elections in general. We see, just from an investment environment, places that were able to hold elections like Indonesia and the Philippines over the course of the last 5 and 8 years have really, for different reasons, but been able to stabilize previous regimes. Philippines trying to move forward, Bruce, as you said, in terms of trying to get some handle on corruption by setting up a regulatory system that is slightly more transparent. Indonesia obviously moving off the Suharto regime and trying to set forth an environment that is, again, business friendly. And each of those are also having elections here in the next 12 to 18 months. And no one really knows where from a business-friendly environment that may go. So elections are always perhaps wild cards. Then we have a place like Thailand who can't seem to hold an election for any one reason or another. And so it's critically damaging the economy and the business environment, not because of the type of election or whether you get a centralized control or uncentralized control, or popular or not popular, but just the inability now to hold an election is holding back the economy.
So can I just put you on the spot then, because you've brought up Southeast Asia a couple of times. So Indonesia, July, Jokowi, the governor of Jakarta, just announced, or his name is in the ring now, formally, as expected. And I think stocks rose several percent just on the news of his candidacy, the currency as well. That's another case of big expectations. And there, I guess the issue is coming back to corruption, that here's a guy who may really mean what he says in terms of going after that. Are those expectations overblown too?
I think any expectation in Asia is overblown, no matter wherever you take it. But again, there is a focus now to try to remove the regulator or the policy-driven corruption element in a variety of these countries. And the smaller politician, the politician you didn't think was going to make that mark, appears to be getting some traction. And whether it can go from traction to expectation to reality, it seems to have done a little bit there in the Philippines, a little bit more in Indonesia. Whether that can continue with the current candidates, we all look forward to.
Can I just jump into one thing?
Yeah.
So I do spend a lot of time in Indonesia, mostly on resource and extraction, coal and power. And we just to plug the Kenny School for a second, wearing that hat, we finished a big report called Transformasi that looked at really the political economy of Indonesia and really where it's going, particularly looking forward to the new election. And what I think, at least the bottom line of it, was fundamentally the economic oligarchy. Despite elections, which are great, the economic oligarchy remains. And so you have very few actors wielding significant leverage in the economy of the place, despite this change from the top. And so for me, at least, while there's growth, I see, particularly, at least in my sector, that it hampers dramatically national outcomes, right? So whether it's, Indonesia was the only Asian member of OPEC, right? Had to suspend its membership because now it's a massive net importer of oil. It's dramatically dropping. It used to be the biggest LNG exporter. So I think those are big structural issues Indonesia has not grappled with.
Okay. I want to come back to China. China, we could spend all night and do a whole conference on doing business in China. And do something that we did with a panel of the Asia Society trustees a couple of weeks ago, which is put people with some expertise, not unlike yours, on the spot and say, okay, mother of all statistical questions, where's the Chinese growth rate going in the next few years? I haven't prepped anybody for these questions, so and if you want to take the fifth, you can. There was a piece in the Wall Street Journal while you think about your answers this morning that said that the It was about stimulus in China, and their approach is probably going to be tweak as you go. But in the, well, I'm not even going to give you a band. Where do you, if you say 3 years out, average growth rate, or with all the talk of bubbles bursting, let's go left to right.
I'd rather go right. I'd rather go right to left.
Yeah, okay, we'll go right to left. Yeah, good.
All right, so the quick answer is, so Xi Jinping.
Oh, just a number.
Okay, yeah. So I would say in terms of 3 years out.
Yeah.
8.3.
Wow. Okay. Well, you're going to have you back here in 3 years.
Fair enough.
5%.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm closer to Gwynn.
Okay.
I think, lower rather than higher.
All right.
And I'm at 6. I think it's barely sustainable to the overall needs of the country. Barely sustainable, 6%.
Now, Gwynn, I'm paraphrasing, but you said something to me that you thought there might be, and you've just given a number to go with it, a significant slowdown and maybe even a bubble bursting, but not necessarily a bad thing. Is that right? And can you explain that?
Yeah, that's right. I think that, I said 5%. I think it would be better if it were lower than that. And the reason for that is, so I think everyone knows growth in China is slowing. It's not slowing to 7.4%, which is the consensus outlook for 2014. It's slowing faster than that. And it needs to slow because right now it is dependent on investment, credit-fueled investment to drive that growth. It is not producing real economic value, is not being reflected in that high GDP growth. So what needs to happen so that economic growth is sustainable and not reliant on credit and not inflating huge debt bubbles such as that which China has now, is that it needs to move towards consumption-driven growth and then also private sector-led growth and service sector, growth of the service sector. So like education, healthcare, elder care, all those things that are controlled by the state for the most part right now. So in order to get there, growth needs to come down first, or really radical sweeping reform that I think would be very difficult to pull off needs to occur. The faster that happens, the better. The other possibility is that it stays growth. The Chinese government figures out how to do a soft landing, as it's called, like keep growth aloft for, it could be a very long time, a decade. I think if that happens, we're looking at a Japanese-style lost decade as fiscal stimulus takes on zombie companies and puts those onto the national balance sheet. So, it would be great if growth slowed a lot faster and we avoided that fate.
Okay, so for the record, the Asia Society trustees were a little more bullish than this group, but Ed Cunningham, you're the outlier here then. Can you explain why you think...
Sure.
Yeah.
So I think the quick answer is, so your question was sort of 3 years from now, 2018, something like that, maybe 2017. And so I think that, I'd say three things really quickly. One is that, so a lot of my good friends in this city who are much smarter than I am have been betting against China for quite some time. And it's fascinating. So we hold these talks quite frequently among us, and they're putting big money against China. And they've been wrong for they've been wrong for the right reasons, right? So all of what Gwynn is saying, I totally agree with. I find that we underestimate the fact, we're biased, right? So we look at China through the lens of still a fairly liberalized market economy. And I think we forget that they have done a fairly good job of changing the rules in the sense that the P is still under the nut, right? And there is no capital account convertibility. I need to see, and for the past 30 years, there's been many books written about this, but I need to see the fuse, right? What is the fuse that will prevent continued, even though it is bad policy in some ways, a continued stimulus. I think that by the time, and the last point is by the time we So we may see some slower growth, certainly, which we're seeing that slower growth, and we may see next year 6.5% to 7%. But if the question is 3 years from now, I think there's going to be a reaction, like we're already seeing the reaction, it's going to be delayed effect of stimulus. I think particularly 3 years from now, it's going to be the transition from the first administration of this regime to the second administration of the same regime. I think there's going to be a lot of political pressure to show the results of the first 5-year administration. And I think that they've proven quite sophisticated at being able to goose that. So that's my take. And I think the politics matter, and the capital count matters in terms of it's just still a closed system.
Okay. We talked about corruption in other places a moment ago. There's been, as you all know, a very public, ever since Xi Jinping took power, a very public campaign against corruption. And there's also a very public debate, and journalists are all over this, about whether this is really just no more limousines and the public trappings of that, or from the standpoint that we're all talking about, and I'm sure your clients are interested in terms of doing business in China. Is there a real change, or is, from what you all see from your vantage points, is it a cosmetic thing? I don't know who wants to start on that one.
I think you had it.
Okay, sure. Yeah. So from my perspective, it's number one, surprising in the sense of how effective it's been, at least on the superficial level. So it's, as everyone probably knows who works there, it's been systemic in terms of its effect. From
systemic corruption or systemic?
No, the anti-corruption push, right? Has affected state-owned enterprises. I mean, to the point where they are literally having to resize the offices of their executives, right, according to state standards. It has affected so that's state-owned enterprises, private enterprises. I've been to multiple sort of end-of-year banquets, even on the private side. They've removed most spending. So from the perspective of, does it set a normative shift in terms of the way that business deals have to happen? Absolutely, massively. And I think it's because it's a pretty profound shift following the Boisilai affair to look pretty deeply at the fact that we have increasingly pretty real political competition finally for the first time. Right? We have rising, significant politicians in China. Hu Jintao was the last anointed, right, from Deng. It is no longer, so we're in this new era where two guys, the number 2 and the number 1, behind the scenes fought it out. It was, the outcome was the outcome. But we have many other players who see that money matters in political competition, and they're building massive war chests behind them, and Boisilai was just one. So I think that the party views this now as a pretty significant issue, not just something we all deal with, but a bit existential. And as a result, I think that we're going to see pretty big an impact, not just on the sort of superficial, but I mean, I see it certainly in the meetings constantly, because now what's happening is you do not, at least from my perspective, it is much less, the interaction is much more direct. It is not through the brother or the cousin who's running a consulting agency that you have to run through. It's very much with the main principal. So I actually think it's pretty significant. I think it takes a long time to have an effect.
I think that's all of that I certainly agree with, and I look at it both in terms of China and the rest of the various Asian countries. But it's about patience, and it's about time, and it's very real. But just as you said to Edward, is it systemic? The anti-corruption movement is systemic, but the corruption was systemic, yes, and in essence hardwired. And to change a hardwiring system to a system where we could see through it and try to make business deals. We see it in various countries now where there actually is access to the government. It's not access through consultants. It's not necessarily access through advisors. Right. It's actually going to the government ministers who are still in power in their own regimes, and being able to ask questions that before you had, unfortunately, to do a different way.
But what about actual transactional stuff? Because again, Actually, I mean, even we at the Asia Society have noticed, and this is obviously a not-for-profits, it's a completely different thing, but when we had a conference last year and the venue that was chosen long before turned out to be problematic because it was sort of too nice for certain government people to come to.
Yeah.
But that is still, to take your word, superficial.
Correct.
So is there, and I don't know, Gwynn, whether your engagement there has been recent enough to say, but is there real change that impacts the way business gets done?
I haven't done enough reporting on that really to weigh in on. I think that Ed's experience probably speaks to the impact on transactions. I guess what I would add to that is that one of the reasons Xi Jinping's crackdown on corruption is really important, ostensibly, is that people aren't happy about corruption, and they're not happy that if you have government connections, you can sort of, kind of amass large sums of money, and everyone else, doesn't benefit from that. The regular people don't. So, this is a really politically important, symbolically important campaign for the leadership to engage in. Is it different from past crackdowns on corruption? It's certainly more aggressive. But the lack of transparency with which it's being carried out. So, for instance, there are activists who are lobbying for government officials to publish their real estate holdings and things like that. They're in prison because they're not allowed to push for transparency. The Chinese government figures out what is transparent, what's not.
Right.
So until there's more openness in the way government officials' wealth and things like that are discussed across the board, it remains to be seen, at least I think, what kind of impact it'll have.
Do you want to weigh in on that?
The corruption it's different things, and we can talk about policy corruption and regulator-led corruption. When you're trying to do a transaction, I think people, and this sort of segues in different elements, but the talent and the management that you have to put in Asia has to be very aware of what they're supposed to be doing and what they're not supposed to be doing. You can't, if you're going to put a carrot out there in front of somebody who's been hardwired in the past, regardless of what is now being asked of them, most of the time they'll grab that carrot. And so you have to be very careful about that. And where we see a difference in transactions where players from the U.S. or the players from Europe who are coming through it through their top management, who are not, who certainly know the rules or know what the rules are supposed to be, that's not necessarily shared by some of the competitors who are now growing in Asia and moving some of their business operations into mainland China, into broader Asian context. And that is, there are some people who are competing now against U.S. interests, the European interests, who aren't necessarily in that same sphere of being aware and being disciplined enough to try to resist that level of corruption. And so the competition to U.S. interests is also a competition where people are playing a little bit different game. And it has and certainly where I see it, where we see it as lawyers in the transactional sphere, in competitive bids, in other ways, we still lose out on U.S. interests simply because we cannot play the full game. We cannot play any game that some of these other competitors existing in Asia from certain countries can.
So it's getting better, but there's still a game.
There's still a game. I certainly say that.
Right.
Yeah.
One other question about China, or issue about China, and then please, we'll come to your questions, so get those ready. The air in China, not something, the pollution in China, not something that we would normally talk about as a business matter. Tom Friedman wrote something a year ago that has stuck in my head and I think about every time I go there, which it was just a great classic Tom Friedman riff on something, but it was the day that a whole bunch of economic indicators came out showing that, I don't know, the GDP and whatever else, the Chinese were cleaning our clocks and most everyone else's. And he wrote a piece that from Shanghai or Beijing, I think, and he said at the end, what's going to happen, or does it matter that we may face a day soon when the Chinese are winning at every major economic metric, but when it comes to the metric of would you ever want to live there or do business there or spend a lot of time in their capital, they are dead last or somewhere near there. How much does just the livability, air quality issue matter? And I guess flip side, and I know at Cunningham you've done work in this area, is there also a business opportunity for clean tech and whomever else to go jumping in?
Sure. You guys want to start?
No. Your turn.
It's such a deferential panel. This is
Well, I mean, on that point, so two things. First, it is getting more difficult to get people to go to China. I mean, it is. It is still seen, Asia is still seen as where the growth is going to be, and so people are very interested in participating. But it is, we are seeing our employees asking for shorter periods of time and much firmer assurances as to when they can come back. To the other point, though, I do think that that is exactly the way business needs to think about that. And one of our very good experiences in China has been aligning our interests with the agenda around those environmental issues. We make an asphalt emulsifier that is 50% the heat, 50% the toxic emissions. And when you have products like that, the government is very enthusiastic, very aligned, and will really help you, so I think there is an emerging business opportunity in that sort of clean tech thing, and I would urge everybody to be very China-focused about those kinds of solutions. But I do think it's a very worrisome trend for businesses, like ours to have increasing difficulty getting employee engagement on the ground.
Do you have to start paying sort of hardship pay like they used to do it?
It's been a dramatic change over the past 12 months, I would say.
Yeah. And it's extended not just in mainland China, but it's extended to Hong Kong as well, where there's been an enormous shift of, as Cunningham was talking about before, where we need a great deal of services. A lot of the investment banking field, the other financial services field, have moved out of Hong Kong for no other reason than the pollution situation coming for itself and through the mainland, moving down to Singapore. The effect of that has been to elevate Singapore as a financial center, probably greater than it might otherwise have been, I think, driven, maybe not primarily, but significantly from a climate perspective. The business opportunity that comes from, I work in the energy area as a law practice, the business opportunity that comes in developing supercritical coal facilities, being able to clean up, being able to promote renewable energy, creates yet another opportunity, both for the mainland, for Japan, for the rest of Asia, to be able to address energy production needs at the same time as you're addressing environmental needs.
Actually, I asked a Chinese American recently who traffics back and forth, and he very confidently said, look, Manchester in England had this problem 100 some years ago. Los Angeles had, maybe not as bad, but had the problem. I mean, in other words, there are, and he just thinks it's an opportunity and the Chinese will get through it. I want to, we have a lot of questions coming in on my little device here, so I'll do one, but if we can pass the mic to anybody who has a question, raise your hand. We have people around here with microphones. There's somebody standing in the back. But we have somebody named Zoe who's asking on Twitter, what are the top 5 things one should look out for before making a decision to invest in Asia? And why don't you each try one? We don't have time for 5, but maybe you've named some of them already.
Regulatory consistency.
All right, Bruce?
So I think greater clarity around intellectual property is another one of those things that still needs work.
Okay.
Seems obvious, but big issue in China, quality of accounting practices.
Ed Cunningham?
I would say the track record, the proven track record of your partner.
Okay. Somebody in the back? Yes, sir.
My question is...
Can you say who you are, if you don't mind?
Oh, sorry, Drew Moffat. My question is, when do you think you'll see a big, large Chinese company move its business out of China? I believe the largest search engine, their revenue accounts for something like 99% of it is within China, and less than 1% is outside of it.
I don't know.
Okay. So if you're saying, when will you see the first Chinese company move all of its operations and investment out of China? Is that your question?
No. Kind of like Google, by comparison, went to China. It was competing against a search engine. There was some of the issues you guys spoke about being favoritism towards that Chinese search engine within the government. But Google exists in Europe and throughout the world. Same with Microsoft. These are big tech companies inside of China that only exist within the Chinese market.
Okay.
So for some reason, I totally don't understand the question.
So are you asking when a Chinese business will be able to sort of translate globally? Is that sort of the gist? Okay. Well, Tencent's a good example. Their WeChat or Weixin app is a social media app that's like really fun. And you can do all these cool things with it, like record little voice memos to people, and instead of having to type. And that wasn't like pioneered by Tencent. There are actually 2 other competing apps in Asia. Line is the kind of the Japanese front runner, although it's actually Korean owned. And Kakao Talk is the Korean one. So WeChat's making a big push internationally. Who knows who's going to win that? And just to give anyone who doesn't know what I'm talking about context, the WhatsApp investment that just happened with Facebook.
How much money again?
That's like
huge.
18 billion.
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, 18 billion.
It's and WhatsApp is like the one that refuses to have any bells and whistles. So if you have something fancy like WeChat, wow, But that's working globally. Tencent's opened offices on the West Coast and is investing in I think developers there and stuff like that. I'm not totally versed in it, but and they're a really sophisticated company, a really savvy company. But I'd look outside of tech stuff, and you don't have to look that far. Haier which makes refrigerators and things like white goods, things like that, has a big presence in the U.S. It has like one of the most popular, like those mini fridges that you see in college dorm rooms. Like it's really good at those, and high-end wine refrigerators actually. So it's got both segments. But they made investments early on and have been very shrewd about positioning their products, and I think they're also benefiting from a widespread misconception that they're German, but maybe not.
But that might not be a bad misconception.
Exactly. But it's happening incrementally, I guess is what I'm saying. And when will the engine of growth be outside of China? I think that you look at that middle class that people are talking about. Like a lot of Chinese companies are going to be leading in those markets, like companies like Haier and stuff like that.
We have a question from members of the Asia Society Business Council here. My company, not identified, my company has hedged our China bets by investing in Thailand. How concerned should we be by the escalating political tensions there, or is this just the same story, different year? Looking for some free advice from you, Ed Koehler.
It's different. The result might end up being the same, but it's different in both depth and perspective. In 2010, we had violent episodes. 2006, of course, we had a coup, but the business environment was immediately restored. In 2010, we had significant violence. It was for a fairly short period of time, but the government stabilized rather quickly. Form of government irrelevant, just the government stabilized. Situation, as we said before, right now is a protracted, not necessarily disruption on the street, but a disruption of government because of the dissolution of Parliament and the inability to have an election. That protraction, I think, is much more scary to the economic environment at least in this term, in the next 2014, maybe in the 2015, before recovery can occur. So I think right now, and I live and work there, so I don't want to discourage too much. But I think in the short term right now, it is a worse investment situation, to be completely honest, than we had in 2010.
So even though we often hear more as visitors, I guess, rather than people doing business, that things are very localized, that you can wander around and everything's fine.
That's all fine, and you can.
Yeah.
And in fact, the protests themselves are basically festivals, which is great because the 2010 ones were deadly. So we'll take the festival, but that's not anything to do with what's actually going on,
right.
Which is regime change or election change or a shift from one form of government to another. We don't know yet because we can't seem to get it done. But it's protracted and it's having a significant economic effect.
Okay.
Tom, can I do just one thing? I might throw you off and you can just tell me I shouldn't do this. Can I just compliment what Gwynn said?
Yes.
One quick point. I think it's an interesting question. I think that it's going to be a long time till you see global champions from China. But what's interesting to me is there's another sort of pole to the spectrum that Gwynn laid out. That was sort of the capital light software, and I think she's right. There's also, I would look at capital intensive industries that are networked. So look at Huawei, which if you look at recent articles, the U.S. government's very happy with the increasing network that Huawei has. So I would look at Huawei and I would look at a company like that, how they're growing very rapidly, number one. Number two, their investment footprint, but number three is how they're affecting standards. So Huawei is a major leader now in shifting standards in telecom. And I think that's kind of an interesting, where I would go in terms of looking, so both light capital and heavy capital.
Okay, saw some hands, sorry. Yep, in the second row here. If you just wait for the microphone and tell us who you are.
I'm Ian. Well, after the AEC finally kicks in, what kind of changes in cross-border M&A patterns are you going to think are going to be seen? Are there going to be a bit more from the more developed Indonesia and Singapore into the Mekong region, or is it going to be more of the outsiders, India, China, Japan, Korea, trying to get into more of the free-flow capital now? That's going to be in the AEC.
Okay, I said when we started that there are people in the audience who know much more about this than I do. I did not understand that question, but do you and whoever? I don't mean, that's very, but
that's more Southeast Asia.
Okay, but if somebody can help, because maybe others don't know what the...
Well, the Asian Economic Cooperation, it's as many of you know, it's a group of 10 nations that has adopted a charter to create both a single product structure base and a common market base. Beginning in 2015. It is geared as you say counterbalance, wouldn't be correct, as a counterweight to India, to China and India, and to allow the Southeast Asian nations to promote by their own business environment and a common business environment by the lowering of tariffs and trade and barriers amongst those nations. Now, where, if I understood at least part of the question correctly, what impact that's going to have, as we've said, I think repeatedly, it's all going to be very slow. I think they're making some significant progress in promoting the single product nature base of the economic charter. That has allowed the Japanese manufacturing companies, the South Korean manufacturing companies to make good headroads in places like Malaysia, Thailand, moving now into Myanmar. The common market aspect of it, I think we're clearly simply at the end of the beginning, to make a bad paraphrase, in which that's going to take a very long time for it to be an economic force. So I think the manufacturing base will lead the products and services base, which is supposed to be part of the common market, considerably.
Ian, did that answer your question? Okay, great. Thanks. About 6 rows up here, right in the middle.
Joyce Slayton Mitchell, a Sino-American education consultant, and I spend about 8 or 9 months a year in China. First of all, I just comment on the wine business. If their wine is as bad as their beer, I don't think the French are going to have to worry. But my question is to do with Japan and South Korea. Right now, kind of fighting it out, and I wonder what the implications for business in China are going to be, if that influences at all where they are thinking of their global brands in both those countries, and other than Tsingtao, not many global brands in China.
Yeah, we have Japan and Korea, we have Japan and China. Anybody want to take that question?
You want to go for it? So I would just say that, so in terms of if the question is about the extent to which political enmity is a major obstacle for Chinese companies in those two markets, then I would agree that it's significant. This morning we had a big series of discussions about the 35th anniversary of U.S.-China relations at the Kennedy School, and it was quite interesting to see how much Japan was raised because of the particular people in the room. Even though the focus was on U.S.-China relations and this anniversary. And it seems that, at least the Chinese companies that I deal with, which are mostly the major state-owned enterprises and to some extent the major privates, they are very much focused on, if they do invest in those two countries, they tend to do it it's called a boomerang, right? So it's through U.S. partners. There's definitely been, I think, an enormous pushback from the Japanese side, particularly most recently, in terms of this continued sort of willingness to not to engage into in many ways deny certain realities. I think in terms of the Chinese argument, and so I think it is significant, yes, and despite the fact that there are clear complementarities when you look at media. I would look at media in terms of South Korea, cultural, right, exports, Japan and Korea. And the other big one that I am involved in is on the energy side. I mean, Japan particularly has ESCOs, energy service companies. It has significant expertise on the efficiency in terms of buildings. And you also see a lot of Japanese companies that, again, through others, are creating major partnerships with the Chinese related to shale, particularly shale exploration, seismic, sort of mini Schlumbergers.
Thank you. Gentleman in the white shirt here. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Anthony Brooks, and my question is regarding the growing middle class that we alluded to in the beginning of the program. With the growing middle class in China and the other Asian countries, do you find that there will be a business potential for American industries to go into China, mainland China, and other areas? Because the middle class wants more quality products that right now the Chinese and the other countries cannot provide, in the sense that we all relate the Chinese products to more lower quality goods, whereas we have in this country still have a manufacturing base such as Boeing that does produce quality goods. So is there a business opportunity for Americans to get back into the game regarding that aspect?
I know I'm not a panelist, but while you think of your answers, I just want to throw one thing out that came to mind while you're asking that. Thank you, which was in sometime last year we had Farouk Kathwari here, who is the CEO of Ethan Allen Furniture. And what was really, really interesting was the extent to which his company has had a really positive turnaround, and I think the furniture industry in this country is not doing, generally speaking, very well, because he and his company have been able to cater to the rising middle class. And so this may be one opportunity to your question, but any others that you can think of? And
Sure. Well, as far as food safety alone goes, the enormous amount of mistrust that Chinese manufacturers have earned themselves, dating back to 2000, or most prominently 2008, when a bunch of babies died from melamine, or consuming melamine, and many, many, many thousands more were sickened. That continues to be, a big area of freak out, rightly so. This is a country where a year ago, 1,300 pigs just floated down the Huangpu River, and people are making jokes about their faucet water being like pork soup and stuff. That's standard. I think people are legitimately terrified of this. It's not that easy to get into the market. The companies, for example, the companies that provide dairy, like infant formula, were all slapped with this, anti-monopoly investigation during the summer last year. So, there are always those things that are going to happen. And meanwhile, there are all these investments in Chinese milk development. But, you're dealing with people's perceptions, and that's so important. And, China's a long way to go before it shakes that. And the government has a long way to go before it earns its credibility. And a lot of times that's local government, not central government, but, it's a really big problem. And anywhere you're talking about children, that's a huge opportunity. Like right now, there's the biggest diaper maker the third biggest diaper maker in Japan, very cleverly, opened a factory in China because people were buying, huge amounts of diapers online in Japan and then, bringing them into China and selling them at, an enormous profit. So this diaper manufacturer is like, oh, I know what I'll do. I'll set up a factory, and then I'll sell it directly, and not, then I can profit, right? No one would buy them because even though they had they were the same brand, and they were supposed to have a, more advanced rash prevention mechanism. So I read.
a little too much information.
But basically, no one will buy them. People continue to buy from online because it's from China. Even a Japanese company making diapers in China, not okay. So but you have to get in the market, and that's really the trouble.
So China's brand problem and this huge, new middle class that the questioner alludes to. I mean, seems like.
So I think enormous, right? So if you look, just witness Shineway Group buying Smithfield Pork, right? Huge. They're going to the IPO of that conglomerate will probably be, I think, this spring, right? So to your point about pork soup coming out of your faucet, so I mean that's a clear, on many levels to me, a clear understanding that there's vertical integration going on where you have massive demand for the middle class pork consumer, lack of supply, and sort of vertical integration going on right from the U.S. side and the Virginia company. So that's an example. I think that it's not just sectoral, right? It's about the factor inputs, right? It's macroecon, right? So basically, if you look at the inputs in China now, back to your original question, you really have power prices, electricity prices are 3 times, 4 times the United States, right? So we're seeing huge power-intensive industries now offshoring from China into the United States. I think it was South Carolina, a big textile, a Chinese textile company just set up shop. So you have power prices that are 3 or 4 times higher. You have labor prices that are dramatically reducing the gap with the United States. And then you have this bigger issue, which is that skilled labor itself, right? Skilled labor, meaning white-collar labor, it's very difficult to get them to stay in China and attract them to China. So what we're actually seeing is I'm sort of a living example of it. My friends increasingly are leaving Beijing, and they're saying, you're PTC, you got it from the beginning because my lungs died after 2 years of going to power plants for the PhD, and we're FTC. So meaning part-time China to full-time. So they're basically saying all the FTC people, full-time China, are now becoming part-time China. So I think that it's true that as a result, the cities that are trying to, back to Gwynn's original point before, China is trying to move up the value chain, right? And to move the value chain, you need skilled labor. All these cities are competing, and they're finding it very difficult to compete to move up that value chain. And as a result, you do see significant investment to the U.S. Yeah, it's exciting, I think.
It's another acronym I didn't know, PTC.
Yeah, FTC to PTC. I stole that from a friend.
So we have another question from our business council, a business council member, again anonymous. Do you think the free trade zones that China is developing and promoting will be exactly that? What are the main opportunities and risks associated with them?
Still back in China. I'll defer over. Yeah, these are my guys. These are our China experts.
We do. There aren't a lot of. So there's a free trade zone in Shanghai. Not a lot about it has been made clear. There are some rules, I think 100 some odd, about what's not allowed. Other than that, not. I mean, there are some.
Ton of publicity about it.
There's a ton of publicity. Although I think Li Keqiang wasn't at the opening thing, so maybe that means that it's fallen from favor. Who knows? And supposedly there are like maybe 10 others that are supposed to open around China. If that happens, like maybe that's a big deal. But it's really hard to say until you have more details, unfortunately.
And history, I think history has not been kind to that idea. I mean, so if you look at other analogies, look at New Songdo City, for example, in Korea, where the Koreans said the same thing, and they said we're going to be this the service boom. You know, we're going to be the center for that service boom. So if you want to get surgery, you just fly to Korea. Makes sense. Foreigners can own land, all of these new things that they were going to do, and it looks, at least from my perspective, from knowing a lot of the developers and others, that those promises weren't kept. So I think we have to wait and see on that.
In India as well.
That one. Yeah, right, exactly. Right.
And what they're saying is like they're going to open, they're going to sort of allow the markets to set interest rates. Big deal. Allow some sort of freer flow of capital. This isn't even an island. This is like a corner of Shanghai. Like, how can you have interest rates be one rate on one side of the street and a different one on a different, like, that, I'm not sure what that distortion will encourage aside from more arbitrage, but it doesn't make a tremendous amount of sense, at least right now.
Okay, we have time for a couple more questions. Yeah, you already have a mic, so you better ask your question.
My name's Alex Levine. My question is, what do you guys see in terms of potential in second-tier cities in China, like outside of Shanghai, Beijing, Guangdong?
Second-tier cities?
Yes. Outside of the three major cities.
A potential for what, though?
Like investment opportunity, and maybe if people are not going to do as much business in certain urban centers because of environmental issues, is there a particular city you see people wanting to go to?
Yeah. And I guess we should define second-tier cities. I was in one recently in China, and it was the size of Norway.
So I take a first crack at it. I think that what I think China has going for it that India still doesn't is that, yes, those certainly second-tier cities, I actually thought you were going more to the third-tier cities, but the second-tier cities all have the infrastructure, right? So they have the network to be able to, and they have become part, at least in terms of commerce, right, to become part of an increasingly national economy. So it's one of the most exciting, is for me one of the most exciting things to see, is that you're really starting to see what used to be de facto regional monopolies, right? So whatever, pick your industry, that now effectively are competing with one another, even the state enterprises, right? So you're starting to get national companies through mergers and acquisitions, and as a result, you're starting to get standardization a bit, I think, at the second-tier city level. So what that means is, as an American, if you're wanting to do business, you're starting to be able to actually have a counterpart that is not only be able to tap into those cities, but do it on a national level. So I think that's quite exciting, and it's a big change than a decade ago. And I think that infrastructure and that corporate restructuring are both really important. So in terms of specific cities you were talking about, what I find so interesting to watch is one of my friends just took over, left his job at GE in Beijing and went to Chengdu and was running their innovation center. So Chengdu, you're seeing quite a bit of pretty significant intellectual capital concentration or agglomeration there. Dalian's another example, I think. We're starting to see the outskirts of places like Chongqing that you can get to an airport fairly quickly, so the northern part of Chongqing. I mean, definitely you're seeing.
Just for the record, Chengdu, second-tier city population?
Yeah, right, yeah. It's probably, I don't know, what is it now? It's probably 12 million, but I could be wrong. 12 million. But Chengdu is 37, I think. Sorry, Chongqing is 37, I believe.
Right. Jackie, second row, yes.
Hi, I'm Jackie Gaspar from Brazil. I live part-time in Abu Dhabi. My question is, I'm very curious about the state of healthcare in China, India, and Brazil. Like, who can compare that? Should I invest in healthcare?
Huh. You asked the right guy right here, right?
Yeah. Well, look, let me talk about India, because I really do think it is interesting. As I mentioned before, I mean, India has an enormous problem. It is. In just a matter of a couple of years, it is going to be the chronic disease capital of the world. And it is, facing a traditional shopkeeper mentality around pharmaceutical. How do you get pharmaceutical products, to all of these people? There is a lot of work underway by some interesting India-based companies to really create kind of organized retail around that problem, and the health services industry is trying to move very fast. I think there is a huge opportunity, I think, in trying to take the resource that India has, which is a tremendous pharmaceutical manufacturing base, and get it to the population that needs it. And I think around those hospital services, around the retail pharmacy, there are tremendous opportunities, and there's some very creative thinking going on. So I think that that is a huge opportunity. But I also think that it is one of those areas that has really created another problem that is even more difficult, I think, to solve, which is just the safety, issues and the counterfeit issues around the pharmaceutical products. So it needs to go hand in hand. There needs to be significant investment and there's significant opportunity in retail distribution, but we have to confront the counterfeit issue, the safety issues, and even the child resistance issues. These are enormous issues that we take for granted that I think represent meaningful investment and business opportunities in India. So I'll stop there.
And yet, wouldn't you say or think, and this maybe is too simplistic, but entrepreneurship in India, we know is an incredible force. We keep talking about the middle class. I don't know that it's rising anywhere as fast as it is there, and probably the middle class dwarfs the population of this entire country. And add to that what you said about the pharmaceutical industry, and whether Modi wins makes a difference or not, I don't know. But so back to Jackie's last question, I think, bullish on healthcare in India, or
so yes, and just to expand on the point a little bit, the creativity of the Indian business community to address these kinds of issues is not to be underestimated. I take to all of the the pharmaceutical executives that I meet with in the United States, the single best example of a package that is designed to educate patients, to incent them to take their medication, and to communicate the appropriate information around dosing, was done in India, and in a matter of weeks. We have been talking about these kinds of issues, iconography and things that really can help patients in the United States for years and years and years. So the ability of India to just act on these kinds of opportunities is impressive. And that Indian entrepreneurship is moving and will move to take advantage of that opportunity. I think there are, U.S. businesses are moving, to try to capitalize as well. It's an enormous opportunity. It's going to, require real creativity, but I think that's what India does best.
I think it's just, and you talk about China, but I think the healthcare industry and healthcare services throughout Asia, it is a huge opportunity. Just the quality of care, both from the mechanics to the pharmaceuticals to the diagnostics, the ability to advance the healthcare throughout Asia is tremendous. On the other hand, that part of the service industry is still subject to significant tariffs, significant restrictions, contradictory restrictions. And so what we alluded to before in terms of regulatory consistency, there continues to be significant barriers to entry where there's accessibility in other areas of the market, medical services industry, medical products industry, there is considerable barriers to entry. In Thailand, for instance, I can get just about any antibiotic I want, including steroids, over the counter. I can't buy Advil. Just the way you try to think about all that and what could be done if we improved and we're able to get tariffs down and services is just amazing.
We have time for one last question. 5 rows up here, if we could.
Hi, I'm Susanna Gilbert. First of all, I just want to say Professor Cunningham. I'm also fluent in Italian and Chinese. Super cool.
All right, we'll meet after.
Yeah, please. Grazie.
Wow.
My question was, as a woman who might relocate we've talked about China, India, and Southeast Asia. Are there any difficulties or challenges that American women in particular face in doing business transactions or in terms of being taken seriously or socially in a social setting?
So I would say,
Okay.
yeah, right, yeah.
I thought maybe
as a woman,
she's
really, I can respond to that. Yeah, that's true. You should probably start. I obviously have an opinion.
Yeah. Well, you haven't started a business in China, but anyway.
Yeah, I think China's always sort of surprisingly, or at least to me, surprisingly respectful of women, and it's something that while I lived there, I would get used to, and then go somewhere else and then be like, what's this catcalling business or something? But whether the degree to which that extends to the finer, the more subtle, the subtler aspects of transactions and stuff like that, negotiations, I really can't say. But I think it's a lot better than other places in North Asia.
Yeah. So I would say that it diverges. So if your counterpart is a state-owned enterprise, for example, you just have to look at the leadership to understand that there's significant bias, right, in terms of on the government side, whether women are leading in China, right? So that's certainly not the case. It's one of our frustrations in running for the past 15 years the major sort of flagship training program for the government through the organization department of the Communist Party. Because there are few women in leadership positions, it's very difficult to get a lot of women in those classrooms with us. On the flip side, it's different, at least from my experience with the private sector, where you do see very significant women who really are quite powerful and are well respected. So there's a bit of a split in terms of the ownership, I think, status of whoever you're working for or with.
Grazie. And I don't speak any Italian. But, well, thank you all. Thank you all for your good questions. Thank you again to Hunton and Williams, not just their representative on stage here, but all of you for sponsoring this. And thank you to a great panel. And again, visit us at asiasociety.org. Come see us on the 8th or before then for the launch of the Policy Institute. And please, one more hand for a really good panel. Thank you.